Welcome everybody to our continuing education webinar this month. It's Understanding Bitcoin Transaction Fees. My name is Tyler Campbell. I'm the Technical Director of the Concierge Service here at Unchained. I'm joined by Buck Purley, our Senior Software Engineer. You can catch these continuing education webinars the first Friday of every month. We're going to be, designing these webinars in a way that helps you along your Bitcoin journey, right? We want to be that navigator. We want to be alongside you, really empower you along your Bitcoin journey through education. Which is different topics, different Bitcoin-related topics, vault-related topics. And this one is understanding Bitcoin transaction fees. So diving into Bitcoin transaction fees and kind of what we're going to be covering here today, just an overview of the agenda. We're going to start with, what are Bitcoin transaction fees and how do they work? Within that, it's kind of like an overview of how we might compare Bitcoin transaction fees to how we might think about transaction fees in the legacy financial system, right? How do Bitcoin transaction fees differ from that of Visa or SWIFT if you're sending a bank wire? And then how are these fees calculated, right? How do they come up with these fees and who are we paying these fees to? Then we're going to move on to what makes Bitcoin fees more or less expensive. We'll kind of segue that into some strategies we can think about when saving on fees, when we're moving Bitcoin across the Bitcoin network. How can we save on fees and put ourselves in a better position to transact? We'll wrap up then with a Q&A. So if you have some great questions, please make sure to enter them into the questions tab in the lower right-hand portion of the Livestorm platform. That way we're going to be able to see them as a team. We can pop them up onto the screen for those live viewers. We're going to be able to answer those questions and answers coming in from the audience. So kind of as that first bullet point, what we really want to dive into here is what are Bitcoin transaction fees and how do they work? So first, Bitcoin fee overview. So with the Bitcoin fee overview, we have, really thinking about this graph. This graph is kind of an interesting thing to kind of look at while we're talking about this slide. I encourage you to look at this graph and try to make sense of the X and the Y axis. I think this is a great place for Buck to kind of tee off. Buck, I know, has written one of the best articles on Bitcoin fees, I think, in the Bitcoin space. It's Understanding Bitcoin Transaction Fees. You can find it on our Unchained blog. So Buck, for the audience viewing this, how can we think about this graph? How can we think about Bitcoin network fees, kind of level setting, in context of how folks might think about normal transaction fees in the financial system?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Tyler. So I think one of the things I like to start with when trying to explain fees is, well, a lot of people come into Bitcoin and they'll send a transaction and they'll see that they're having to pay fees, whether it's an exchange or on our platform or on your own. And it's like, well, why am I paying this? Like, what is this actually for? And it can be particularly confusing because if you are comparing it to the legacy financial system, what we pay fees for there, the mental model is actually totally different. So we start off, if you're thinking about spending credit card transactions or like Tyler said, like wire fees, things like that, you're typically actually paying proportional to the amount of value you're sending, right? This is how, and this is really a supply and demand thing, and the banks are basically saying, if you're spending more, you probably care more about that transaction getting sent, and so we can charge more for that, essentially. Bitcoin is different. Bitcoin is basically just a data transfer layer. That's all it is, right? Like all of this, what we're using as money is still just data at its base. And to send and store data, it costs something, right? And that's the real resource that we're taking up. And so, in any case, what's important is that to pay more transactions in Bitcoin, when you're paying higher fees in Bitcoin, you'll pay higher fees for faster transaction processing, not the amount of money that you're sending. There's other aspects that go into it, but that's really what this graph is showing. As you can see on the blue line that's horizontal, it really doesn't matter. Like the price doesn't change based off of processing time. It'll be the same processing time no matter what they charge. It doesn't really change the priority. You swipe your credit card, it'll get processed as it gets processed. But in Bitcoin, that's not the case, especially if you have high congestion. If you want your transaction to process quickly, like, so for example, if you're trying to top up your collateral for a loan because you don't want to get margin called because, price movements, you will pay a higher transaction fee to get that transaction into your collateral address faster. And last point here is that who is getting paid? That's also a question. Like, I thought, nobody owns Bitcoin. Who am I paying? Like, there's no banks. What's going on? And the reason is you're paying the miners because the miners are doing the processing, and you're basically asking them, here, I'm going to pay you more to mine my transaction faster. And so yeah, that's the basics of the relationship for fees.
Awesome. Now, having that mental model in mind, now thinking about processing time is really, what might cause you to pay more in fees. You kind of want to think now even a little bit deeper of how are fees actually calculated. So as Buck was describing, this is like a data transfer layer, right? So you think about the amount of data that you're moving in a Bitcoin transaction. So Bitcoin transactions, if I want to send Bitcoin to Buck, if Buck wants to send Bitcoin to Justine, Bitcoin transactions, you're paying these miners, the miners that you're paying the fees to, you're paying for the amount of data that you're moving around the network. So we have this kind of helpful graph that we've made analogies to in the past. It's really like you can think about it as if you're shipping a package, right? If a package is a little bit heavier, you're going to be paying more to ship that package versus if it's lighter, regardless of the contents on the inside of the package, right? You could be shipping a 1 pound MacBook worth $2,000 for the same shipping price, or for even cheaper maybe, than you're paying for 50 pounds worth of some good that's not nearly as expensive as that MacBook. So we're thinking about the amount of data in a transaction as impacting those fees. So you're going to see here on the screen, we have a transaction data graphic. So all of the things, the technical things that are input into transaction data, you have the metadata and the inputs and the outputs. We're going to talk more about that in a second. But you see here that there's each line item under the transaction data has bytes on the right-hand side. So for example, that input line, that second line there is 114 bytes. So, if you kind of do a deep dive on Bitcoin transaction fees, or even if you're in your Unchained vault and you're authoring up a withdrawal, you're going to see a fee rate posed to you on the transaction modal, where you're entering how much Bitcoin you want to move. Then you get to choose a fee. We have a high priority and a low priority fee that really speaks to the processing time that Buck was just talking about in the prior slide. Now, with that fee, you see a sats per byte, or a sats and then a /byte is the fee rate. So kind of putting that into perspective, you can kind of see how that connects here to this transaction data. This transaction that we're looking at now is made up of, just about under 200 bytes, maybe just over 200 bytes if I'm doing public math here. Now these bytes, there's a Satoshi per byte fee rate on the Bitcoin blockchain, right? We're going to be talking about that in just a little bit more. But just to kind of give a high level overview, transaction data, it's weighted in bytes, and a Satoshi is, of course, the smallest unit of a Bitcoin. There are 100 million Satoshis in one Bitcoin. So we think about fees in terms of how many Satoshis per byte are you paying in a given transaction. So if I have the same amount of transaction data, I could move 1,000 Bitcoin, which is, of course, a lot of money in US dollar terms. But if the same transaction data, if I'm just moving maybe $10 worth of Bitcoin, it's the same transaction fee. Assuming you're sending at the same time on the Bitcoin network, you have the same desired processing time in play too. So really, again, busting that mental model, thinking that it's not a percentage of the transaction being moved. It's not like how we think about it with credit cards and with wire transfers. It's really about the data that you're shipping around the network. And it's commonly denoted in your Unchained vault, of course, and other Bitcoin wallet softwares you might use. Even on exchanges, they're going to denote this fee in Satoshis per byte. And you might even see it displayed as 0.000000538 Bitcoin or something like that. Those are Satoshis.
If I could interject real quick too, one thing I think that's to understand about why we're paying for the data transfer. There's a lot. We actually just published an article about why it's important to run your own node, for example. And the reason why you're paying for data is the cost that is imposed on everybody else on the network, right? So if it were free to send this data, every node, not just the miners, but every node has to deal with it. Because when you're broadcasting a transaction before it even gets mined, nodes receive that, they verify it to make sure that it's safe to send along. Once it's mined in a block, every new node, every existing node is going to validate that as well. And you store it locally as well. So every time you send a transaction, you're adding data that everybody has to carry as that burden of. So that's like, you want a market in this because it imposes a cost. There would otherwise be an externality. And that's the important thing. Whereas when you're sending credit card transactions, the data that you're sending is not actually part of the cost. It is actually more about the value. That's what they care about more. There's higher compliance and legal costs if you're sending more value. But here, the cost, the burden that you're imposing on the network is the amount of data.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you, Buck. And now, just kind of as a stopping point here, just to kind of recap what we've covered so far, because I know Bitcoin fees can be their own rabbit hole in thinking about all this stuff. So we have, the Bitcoin fee overview, right? We're paying for processing time. We want our transaction confirmed really quickly on the Bitcoin network. We want maybe we don't care about how fast our transaction's processed. And I can send desired amount of Bitcoin over to Buck, but if it doesn't get processed till later tonight, that's fine. I'll pay a lesser fee to do so. We know that we're paying for processing time. We also know that the fees are really calculated based on the amount of data you're moving around the network. But now with that as our basis, we really want to dive a little bit deeper into, well, what makes Bitcoin fees more or less expensive at any given time, right? What if there is 1 million of us that hold Bitcoin, and all 1 million of us would like our transaction confirmed in the very, as soon as possible, right? We want that processing time to be really fast, but there's 1 million of us trying to do so at the same time. What constraints are there in play? How does kind of this fee network or this fee structure make that differ? How does the fee network kind of put itself in the position where it makes people compete and possibly pay even higher fees? So to kind of put that into perspective, we think about what makes Bitcoin fees more or less expensive. Well, it's really comprised of two parts. We have the size of the transaction data, which Buck is going to do a little bit of a deep dive into here. Then it's not only the size of the data, like we were talking about before with that shipping counter analogy, but it's also the scarcity of each Bitcoin block. It can only fit so many transactions in it. We're going to talk about that too. But to start, the size of that transaction data. That graph that we showed before where you were weighing a Bitcoin package on the scale, it was made up of a certain amount of data, just over 200 bytes. Well, in that, there's an input section. And kind of helps because we're thinking about multisig specifically in the context of Unchained. How does multisig impact the amount of data that's being tossed around? Buck, if you could expand more on this, that'd be perfect.
Yeah, sure. So, this is another part of, blockchains in general and Bitcoin with that kind of change our mental model about what sending digital money, digital transactions looks like. Again, if you're sending a credit card transaction or a wire transfer, the amount of data is basically fixed. You have who's sending it, who you're sending it to, whatever. That's not the case in Bitcoin. Now, there's a few things that factor into what the size of the transaction is. First, if for anyone here that has been part of our previous continuing education webinars, I think we have some articles about this too, about UTXO consolidation. This is one piece of what contributes to the size of the transaction. That's the number of inputs. So the way that the Bitcoin blockchain keeps track of the ledger of all of the balances of all people that have used Bitcoin. I won't go too deep into it, but we have what's called the UTXO set, the unspent transaction output set. And basically what that is, that's the ledger of all Bitcoin that have been sent to some destination and that are basically available to be sent in another transaction. So you have your wallet, you've been sending, regular dollar cost averaging transactions to yourself. Once a month, you send some Bitcoin into your multisig wallet. Each one of those sends is its own UTXO. Now, if you're going to spend that, that's going to be, each one of those is an input. So if we see this box on the left-hand side here in transaction data, you'll see there's metadata and then there's input. Each UTXO is going to be its own input. So the more inputs that you have, the larger your transaction is going to be. You're going to have a more expensive transaction to send. This is one of the reasons why we recommend, and we'll talk more about this in strategies later, for UTXO consolidation. The other thing that adds is the number of outputs. Actually, and to understand what I'm talking about too, Drew put in the chat, the largest transaction ever sent. This was basically, I think it was only 0.05 BTC. So again, not value of the transaction itself, but the size. And it filled up an entire block. So there was only one transaction other than the Coinbase transaction in this block. And it was all inputs of very small amounts to create one transaction. So the other thing that you can do to add to the size of your transaction is the number of outputs. So typically you'll have 1 to 2 outputs in a transaction. That's usually where the destination that you're sending to, and then some change. If you're doing a sweep, a UTXO consolidation, you're only going to have 1 output because you're sending it all to 1 address. Okay, and the last thing that is shown here is the size of the input itself. And this is really important, especially if you're a customer of Unchained or you do multisig on your own. Because you might be surprised to find that fees are going to be a little bit higher. I should also say to highlight, Tyler was saying earlier, when you set fees typically in transaction, this is true on our Unchained platform too, you're setting a rate. So it's the number of Satoshis per byte of data. So it's not, you will be able to calculate after that, set the total amount of Satoshis that you're going to be paying in fees. So you would have a set rate, and then the amount of data that is in this transaction is going to impact the total fee, the absolute fee that you end up paying. So ultimately, you're generally want to try and minimize this under certain circumstances. So a normal input is a pretty basic data structure. It just has some metadata that kind of, it has some information about the UTXO that you're spending, and then the signature. This is what, when Justine was talking earlier about unlocking your Bitcoin with this key, the signature is the proof that you own that Bitcoin. You add the signature and you're good to go. This data is a little bit bigger though when you have multisig, and the reason for that is in a normal single signature input, let's say if you just have a single signature with a single device, for example, there's just that 1 signature. There's a lot more data in multisig. It's not just the 2 signatures if you're doing a 2 of 3, but it's also, you have to show the public key for each key in that quorum, right? So if we have 2 of 3 with Unchained, that means you have to show each of the public keys that might sign. So that includes, if you're signing for yourself, you're still going to include Unchained's public key in that input data. So 3 public keys and then 2 signatures. So you can see how this starts to grow. First, if you have, let's say, a 3 of 5, now you need 3 signatures and 5 public keys that are going to be in this input data. And the more inputs that you have this amount of data in each input, right? So you can see here, so let's say we have 2 inputs. Now that means you're going to have in the data that you're sending 6 total public keys and 4 total signatures. So that grows the number of inputs that you have. So you can see how having multisig, while it's obviously beneficial for security, and this is what you really want to do, it does impact your spending behavior, because now you're asking essentially the network to carry more data for you.
And thinking about that, it's like, taking the sum total of everything in your transaction data, you get X number of bytes, you multiply that by the fee rate in Satoshi per byte, and that's your Bitcoin transaction fee. Like Buck said, you can quickly see how, especially in multisig, right? Maybe you hear about these quorums. You think about multisig. We use a 2 of 3 to keep things simple, keep the number of total items you need to manage simple. You think about as you expand even to 3 of 5 or 5 of 7, you can imagine how quickly the transaction fee that you're going to be paying to move that data around the network, essentially your Bitcoin package that you're trying to move, becomes really, really, really heavy. So we have all of these, this mental framework now around paying for transaction data. But also it's really, really helpful to think about, okay, well, that processing time, right? Fitting into a block. I know we have a graph here. It's kind of a lot to grok, so you can take a couple moments just to look at, again, the X and Y axes and what we're displaying here, and Buck's going to walk through it. We really want to think about supply and demand as it relates to a given Bitcoin block, right? If there's a lot of demand for for getting your transaction processed as fast as possible, right? That high priority. If there's a lot of demand and there's limited supplies, blocks are only so big. That's going to, of course, supply and demand. If you take in even 8th grade level economics, that supply and demand, if the supply is held constant, the demand is increasing. That's going to put upwards pressure on any price. In this instance, it's the price of the transaction fee. So this graphic is pulled again from Buck's incredible fee article. Buck, if you want to give a little bit more context on this graph.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we go back to the shipping analogy once more, you can think about this kind of like, okay, we can even remove the comparison of the different weights. Let's say you want to send that laptop. It's going to cost a different amount to send it in the middle of summer than it's going to cost it to send it right around Christmas time, right? because there's a limited capacity. Even though you can increase the number of trucks and shipping, you are going to run into limits, and therefore it's going to cost more to ship things in a high congestion time, right? You see this in like highway tolls as well. Like the more that there's traffic, if you want to have a high priority lane, you're going to have to pay more for it, or just to cross the bridge. Sometimes they'll have pricing like this. So a bridge is actually a good way to think about it. If you think about a bridge of having a limited number of lanes, a limited amount of capacity, there are only so many cars that can fit onto that bridge at a given time. And so one way that you can help congestion is actually increase the price that it costs to be on that bridge at that time. And what that means is it allows people to self-sort based off of how urgent, how important it is to them to be on that bridge at that precise time, which actually alleviates congestion. This is one of the reasons actually why having this limited block space is important, because it introduces this idea of a fee market. So how can we apply this to Bitcoin transactions? You can think about, let's say, for example, so if there's not a lot of trading activity, not a lot of news items hitting Twitter, you can send a transaction within 1 or 2 blocks and just have a 1 sat per byte fee rate, and it'll probably get in within 10 minutes, 10 to 20 minutes. Now let's say all of a sudden Elon Musk, he hits Twitter and he has a big announcement that Tesla's going to buy another $1 billion worth of Bitcoin. Now all of a sudden everyone's going crazy, like, oh my God, Tesla's going to do this. I want to get into. The price is going to go up. All of a sudden, the demand has shifted, right? This is what this shift in that blue curve on that graph is showing. The demand is shifting. Now we have more transactions trying to get into the same number of blocks. And some people want to get in really quickly. Like, let's say you're trying to send some Bitcoin, or you're trying to buy some Bitcoin on the exchange, right? And so all of a sudden exchanges have to have more Bitcoin available, and they're sending to their hot wallets, and people are trying to withdraw, send it to their multisig. All of a sudden you have this greater activity. It's filling up blocks. Now we get to have some of this price discrimination here, right? So if you're not as urgent, let's say you're just moving from, you want to withdraw some of your collateral in your loan back to your vault. It's not a super high priority. It would just be nice to have, get it back to your vault. Okay, set a low fee rate. Maybe it gets in a couple hours. You don't really care. You don't want to pay that high fee rate, because you're not rushing around, because you're hodling, you're saving for the long term. You're not going to react to the Elon Musk news, so you pay a lower fee rate. So this allows us to have like a little bit more of a dynamic market, which is really important. And of course, the same is true in the other direction with bad news that will come out. Even if the price is going down, that's like, again, the world of Bitcoin is actually totally devoid of the price of Bitcoin itself, right? So you can have high demand for block space when the price is going down, because people are trying to send their Bitcoin from their hardware wallets to their exchange, or the exchanges as well are moving a lot of Bitcoin around because people are trying to sell it, right? And Elon Musk says the opposite news and says that Tesla's going to sell their Bitcoin, and it can go the other direction. So, and again, you don't care because you're holding Bitcoin for the long term, so you can adjust your fee rates accordingly.
And on the left-hand side of this graph, we see the transaction fees as they're displayed on the Block Explorer mempool.space. So that is mempool.space. A really fantastic block explorer that not only shows you kind of a graphical representation of blocks being added to the Bitcoin blockchain, but also kind of the fee rate at any given time. So you can kind of see, hey, what is it going to cost me roughly Satoshis per byte to get into, a high priority block, maybe the next block, versus, like, I don't really care. I'm like Buck said, I'm a long-term hodler. I just need to move my Bitcoin maybe from my mobile hot wallet that I use over to my vault, because I want to secure those sats in multisig. I'm just sending to myself. I might pay a lesser fee. So that mempool.space, that block explorer, is a really, really cool resource. Now, if you're looking at that graphic on the left-hand side, you're going to see that number in green, right? The dollar amount, because that's what our minds like to go to. That's how we help picture it and frame it in our minds. You're going to see that high priority, 17 Satoshis per byte, translate roughly to, what is that, 73 cents, doing a live eye exam here on the webinar, 73 cents. Now, that is kind of just making an assumption, right? That's not taking into account which wallet you're using. If you're using a multisig, as Buck was just mentioning, you're going to have more inputs into your transaction. So just because that 17 sats per byte is the fee rate doesn't mean that you're going to see 73 cents as a transaction fee reflected over in your Unchained vault. There's more going on behind the scenes. So it's really just a rough estimate. Now, looking at that Satoshis per byte, that does help you when thinking about, hey, if you need to move Bitcoin for whatever reason, you want to keep an eye on kind of the fee market, as Buck was just describing. Using a tool like this, using mempool.space is really fantastic. And they just came out with a number of really cool updates to their site. It's very visually pleasing. I would recommend bookmarking it in your internet browser just to check it out every now and then. I think slowly looking at resources like that really does help you along your Bitcoin journey, in addition to webinars like this, of course. But big fan of mempool.space and what they're showing over there.
I wanted to answer this question that somebody put up. I think you can see it. So there's this question about if the Taproot feature will enable lower transaction fees. The reason I just want to talk about it is because it's useful to answer this question in the context of this slide here. So to answer without going too deep into technical details, it can under certain circumstances. So basically Taproot, the best way to think of Taproot in the context of fees, at least in terms of like what it is as a technology, is it allows the ability to basically compress some of this data. And specifically actually does this with something separate from the Taproot stuff, which is introducing a cryptographic signing scheme called Schnorr signatures. And this allows you to aggregate the signatures. And this is really important because it basically means that we can, under optimal circumstances, so not in all circumstances, and this is why it's a little bit, it's a little bit trickier than the way I'm describing it, but under the like 95% of circumstances, when you're signing, you can make your input look like your multisig input look like the one on the left, the normal input. And it does that by saying, you can basically offline or off-chain combine, aggregate two signatures and make it look like it is one signature and you would do the same thing. Like you compare that to, you take two public keys, you combine those public keys to make it look like one public key, combine two signatures into one signature. And so there you get some space savings. If you're not doing a 2 of 2 situation, then it gets a little bit more complicated, and the mass and the size of the transaction can start increasing a little bit more.
So this is the magic that is offered at Austin BitDevs. So if you're a client of ours and you love hearing Buck dive into this stuff, and you've been dying to get to the Bitcoin capital of the world in Austin, Texas, I highly encourage you to make the trip down and attend our Austin BitDevs the third Thursday of every month, because Buck will dive into this stuff, plenty of other items as well. I mean, it's always fascinating. Thank you, Buck.
Sure.
So now that we kind of have covered, you're paying to ship data around the network. Sometimes that network itself might be congested and there's a lot of demand. That's all impacting the fees. But okay, that's all great, but how can we think about saving on fees? What are the steps, the low-hanging fruit that we can do to use as a strategy to start saving on Bitcoin fees? Maybe what are some advanced options as well? So really, when we're thinking about strategies to save on fees, we have some beginner strategies. And the first one is really just keeping an eye on the mempool, right? Looking at a resource like mempool.space to see where the network is at any given time in terms of just total congestion. Now you're going to see there's a screenshot that I've added here on the right-hand side for fee alert. So this tool was built by our very own Buck Purley. It is TX fees, so it stands for transaction fees, txfees.watch. You can actually sign up to get alerted when there's a certain type of network congestion, whether there's low fees or high fees. You can sign up and use this tool just kind of in addition to keeping an eye on the mempool. It's kind of a nice way for you to just get email updates on the Bitcoin network. Now, the next component of beginner strategies, and I know it's a UTXO management, might sound like not the most beginner strategy, but as Buck was highlighting earlier, you want to minimize the amount of inputs that you're giving to or that you're applying to a specific transaction. And the way to do that is by making sure that you have a sound UTXO strategy that you're deploying in your vault, for example. So a UTXO, just kind of a high-level overview of that. For the purposes of our vaults as they operate today, you can think about each deposit to a given vault address is going to be a new UTXO that's sitting on that address. And if you've deposited 10 deposits to an address, that address now is the weight of 10 UTXOs. So we talk a lot about UTXO consolidation, basically merging all of those 10 deposits just up into one deposit now on a new address. That's a UTXO consolidation. That's making 10 inputs, that's turning 10 inputs in a future transaction just into one input. With that, you're making your package just a little bit lighter to move around the network, and you can really save on fees by doing that. So UTXO management is certainly something I encourage you to practice, possibly going back and looking at our previous continuing education webinar on the topic. It's really, really a nice thing to do. And also, like everything else, helps you learn just a bit more about Bitcoin and how it operates underneath the hood. The third beginner strategy.
I want to add one more thing about the UTXO management. It's another thing that's kind of confusing about this. It can seem, so one thing that some people do, and some wallets actually do this for you automatically, and it's kind of wrong. You think initially, right? Okay, in order to spend less on fees, I want to have fewer inputs, right? So what some wallets will do and what some people might do with UTXO management, this is even when you're doing the UTXO consolidation, it's an important thing to keep in mind. This is why we kind of recommend it. And where the TX fees alert can come in is, so what you'll do is like, okay, I want to send 1 Bitcoin and fees are low, and I either have 10 UTXOs that add up to 1 Bitcoin, or I have 1 UTXO that is 1 Bitcoin on its own. Which one do you choose? So now a lot of wallets will say, okay, at this point in time, it's obvious that having 1 UTXO with 1 BTC is going to be cheaper to spend. But over the lifetime of your wallet, is that really the best strategy? Because what happens if in the future, in 3 weeks now, you want to send 1 BTC again, and now fees are much higher? Now, all of a sudden, you have to spend the more expensive transaction at a higher fee rate to get the same result. So it's not always the case. Sometimes you might actually, maybe you'll send 1 BTC. If you wanted to do this really manually, you're sending 1 BTC. You'll take the 1 BTC and 5 UTXOs to consolidate. You'll send back in change, and now you have 5 smaller UTXOs and 1 medium-sized UTXO. That in the future would be cheaper. And so while it's like it's found that one of the best strategies is actually just random UTXO UTXO selection. The reason for that is just over time, it'll likely average out, because that's the thing, is you want to think about the fees that you're paying over the lifetime of your wallet, of your usage of Bitcoin. And so it's not as straightforward as always minimizing. So one of the ways that you can use this fee alert system is say, oh, I found that fees are low. I'm just going to spend money to myself now, or maybe I was waiting to do a transaction that wasn't really urgent, and I'm going to send a lot of UTXOs and use that at this point in time. And so a lot of people just use it to get notified when fees are higher. It's actually most useful to know when fees are lower, because that's when it's a good time to send some transactions to consolidate. Sorry.
No, that's absolutely perfect. And I mean, as the builder of txfees.watch, I feel like it's important to call that out. The last beginner strategy, just to lightly touch on, it's worthy of an entire presentation on its own. But give the Lightning Network a try. Fund a Lightning wallet. There's plenty of open source, free content resources out online that describe the Lightning Network more and how you might be able to use the Lightning Network, moving Sats, moving these Satoshis, moving Bitcoin between each other by really just making use of this incredible, what's referred to as a layer 2 technology that really helps you save on fees. Fees are incredibly either minimal or essentially non-existent with the Lightning Network. It is a really, really fun thing to dive into too, and kind of growing your know about Bitcoin. Diving into the Lightning Network certainly helps you do that. So now, those are the beginner steps you can take, and that UTXO management, along with keeping an eye on the mempool, combined right there, that's some awesome low-hanging fruit. But now there's some advanced strategies we can kind of dive into. So Buck, if you want to talk a little bit more about these advanced strategies as well.
Yeah, for sure. And actually kind of like a medium strategy that combines UTXO management with the Lightning Network before we get to the other two is you could consolidate UTXOs when fees are low to open a Lightning channel. Because in order to open a Lightning channel on the Lightning Network, you actually spend a transaction to open that channel. It's a good time to just consolidate some small UTXOs spend it to that channel, you open up the channel, now you have fewer UTXOs, and you have the Lightning Network open for when fees are higher in the future. So that's a kind of a neat little trick that you can use too. Okay, so for the advanced strategies. So these strategies are both kind of centered around this idea of you get more flexibility in how you react to market conditions. Both of these are actually used in layer 2 technologies like Lightning Network as well, because when you don't know about what the future fee conditions are going to be like, these strategies are really important. So the way that they actually operate is essentially you send a transaction with a lower fee than might be necessary. Because what happens, it's not like these transactions just don't go anywhere. With too low of a fee. What happens with a transaction with a fee that's too low, or let's say you sent it out, or this can happen on our platform too. For multisig, you and your business partner each have a key, and you sign your transaction to pay your company salaries or whatever on Friday, and your business partner can't get to their key until Sunday. They sign the transaction. Now all of a sudden fees are a lot higher than when you created the transaction in the first place. With these more advanced strategies, you can still save yourself from this. So you have this lower fee, the transaction goes out, and now it's just hanging out on the mempool. You'll see, transaction broadcast in your vault. You might go to mempool.space or blockchain.info on a block explorer and say, hey, my transaction's there, but it hasn't confirmed for a couple hours. What do I do? So you can use replace by fee or child pays for parent. I won't go too much into. So replace by fee is you have to basically sign up for it ahead of time. You have to indicate in your transaction that you want this transaction to be replaceable, because if you don't, then there's some tricky technical problems with it. And child pays for parent. So and then it's in the mempool. If it's replaced by fee, you can send a new transaction that replaces that one. Without the flag, nodes will reject that because they say, oh, you're trying to double spend, and this is not allowed, at least by policy. What child pays for parent does, it's a little bit, it's pretty neat and quite clever, and this is what they use in the Lightning Network, is if you control one of the outputs that the transaction is spending, you can spend an output, it's a UTXO, right, that hasn't been confirmed in a block yet. So you can have a chain of transactions where you have a parent that has the fee that's too low and the child that's spending from that parent. If that child pays more fees for both itself and its parent, right? So the child is paying for the parent. Let's say the parent was only paying 500 satoshis, but given the fee rate, it should have been paying 1,000 satoshis. And this child transaction, this also needs to pay 1,000 satoshis, but it'll pay 2,000 satoshis because it's going to pay for itself and this. And the reason why that works is miners will see it and say, oh, if I want that 2,000 satoshis, I want to mine this transaction. But this transaction can only be mined if the parent is mined because it's spending from that output. So if that makes sense, so you have this chain of transactions that in order for a miner to get the fees, it needs to get all of them together. Even though this one has fees that are too low, because the fees on this one are high enough, it'll take both of them. And that's how you can bump a transaction. This can be useful for fee savings because you can send a transaction in the hopes that you don't have to spend that higher fee transaction. If that works, great, you saved on fees. If it doesn't work, okay, now you have this other strategy. So the hope is that over a long period of time, it'll end up evening out or in your favor, such that because enough times the lower fee transaction is actually getting mined, is getting confirmed, okay, you're good to go. And if it doesn't, you can still get it confirmed by either doing RBF or child pays for parent.
And I will just mention both replace by fee and child pays for parent are described also again in Buck's fee article that was shared in the chat. So, for any viewers that might be looking at this later on YouTube or something, it's what the fees, understanding the costs of Bitcoin transactions on the Unchained blog. I, again, definitely encourage you to check that out. So now we want to move over to our Q&A. Before we fully dive into the Q&A, and I see there's some questions kind of in that question queue, we did run a poll during this webinar as Buck and I were sitting here talking to you about fees. There's a poll being run in the background. It was recently Bitcoin Pizza Day. So in May 2010, Laszlo Heinz, I hope I pronounced that correctly, set out to buy 2 large pizzas with Bitcoin. So as we kind of know, it was like 10,000 Bitcoin transaction back in the day, which is, of course, an incredibly large sum of US dollars today. The question in the poll was, how much was the Bitcoin fee that Laszlo paid for this Papa John's pizza? So the options were 0.000001 Bitcoin, none, or 0.99 Bitcoins, almost 1 full Bitcoin in fees. So looking at the votes that came in, we see that about the 0.000001 Bitcoin is tied with none as the top answers that were selected. But the actual answer to this is 0.99 Bitcoin. Laszlo actually paid almost 1 full Bitcoin in transaction fees to pay for those Papa John's pizzas. So of course, 1 Bitcoin to 10,000 Bitcoins was the amount being paid. In terms of just those raw amounts, it was a negligible fee. Of course, now in present day times, that's about a $30,000 fee to purchase some pizzas. So that is, heck of a birthday party or whatever he was trying to throw. Wow.
I can actually share a related story on a personal level. I didn't quite pay that much in fees, but it helps, I think, illustrate the way that you will think that you should be thinking about fees. So I recently had my first child was born last year, and I wanted to celebrate mark her birth with a transaction on the Bitcoin blockchain. And you can embed small messages in there. And so I knew that I was not going to have time to compose this transaction and get it funded and do all this sort of stuff in the middle of labor and whatnot. So what I did was I pre-made the transaction. I had this transaction. It was funded. It was valid on the blockchain. I had the output, but I didn't want to send it yet. I only wanted to send it right when she was born. And so to do this, and I didn't want it to be sitting in the mempool. If fees all of a sudden got very high in 2-3 days later when this ended up happening, I didn't want my transaction to be stuck. I wanted it to be mine. So I significantly overpaid in fees. I paid several dollars during a low fee period. And as soon as my daughter was born, I hit send, the transaction goes out, and it was confirmed in the next block. So now I know exactly the block at which my daughter was born. And so that just the highlights, if you're time sensitive, right? And also if you don't know what the fee rates are going to be, that's how you can start thinking about fees.
Awesome. That'll be a great anecdote to tell your daughter when she's older. So now we're going to dive into the Q&A here as our last component. So we're going to bring up for the viewers on the live stream. You should be able to see these questions get popped up for your viewing pleasure if you're watching on YouTube later on. But we're going to reiterate the question and ask it aloud so you know what we're answering here. So Buck, if you want to take a look through the questions as well, I'm doing the same, seeing what was upvoted. I know you answered the one about Taproot, which is fantastic.
Yeah, sure. I can answer this as well from Patrick. So the question is, am I correct to think that the more nodes on the chain, the faster transaction times and lower fees will be charged? The short answer is no. A couple of clarifications too, that there aren't nodes on the chain. The chain is just a chain of blocks, and those are basically put transactions in a block, and the blocks are connected in this chain. Nodes, on the other hand, they're basically the verification mechanisms. You use your own node to verify transactions that are coming in, transactions that are broadcast in the network, and your own transactions that you want to send out, and make sure that you can't be censored that way. So nodes are not doing they cannot speed this up at all, because nodes are just doing this verification. They can help, well, okay, that's not quite true. So we're not running into this bottleneck yet, but and the core developers for the Bitcoin core code base and other implementations as well have done a lot of work to reduce network congestion. So you can imagine a world where if they weren't doing this work, you would want more nodes so that the transactions could get out faster. Because what you're really trying to do when you send a transaction is get them to a miner. Once a miner sees them, if the fees are high enough or the congestion is low enough, they'll put it in. That's all that's relevant. So they won't help transaction times because on average, blocks are mined every 10 minutes. It doesn't matter how many nodes are on the network. In a short period of time, if all of a sudden mining hash power went way up, that could temporarily increase transaction times because blocks are getting mined fast. And if you go to mempool.space, you can see the intervals. Like sometimes you'll have 3 blocks in 3 minutes, and then sometimes you'll have it'll take 30 minutes for one block to be mined. So, and even, having more miners on the network won't necessarily impact that because there's an element of randomness. We're just aiming for that average of 10 minutes. And the only way that it can also impact lower by fees is if you have many blocks being mined. That will reduce congestion because so let's say you have a mempool with 10 blocks worth of transactions that are waiting to be mined. If 10 blocks are mined very quickly, that will empty out the queue pretty quick, and then fees can go down after that. But the relationship between the two is kind of tenuous and disconnected, and that's important actually for some of the dynamics and the game theory that's involved in making the blockchain work, frankly.
Awesome. I actually have a question there. I guess putting myself in the perspective of an audience member, just thinking about Bitcoin terminologies and fees. Kind of an interesting one is the concept of dust and why dust is dust and how transaction fees might play into that. So, Buck, if you could dive into dust, I know it's kind of just being thrown at you, but it's
Sure.
a very fascinating thing, and I think it's something as you go deeper on your Bitcoin journey, you come across these weird little phrases. But dust transactions, what do those mean?
Yeah, so dust was a concept that I think was originally introduced in kind of the early days of Bitcoin. There were these applications that were being built on top of Bitcoin that were kind of using up block space for things that weren't money. And ultimately, that's not necessarily a bad thing because you have to pay for the space, but especially when fees were low, it was something. And as we said, there's the block space, but every node has to validate that data. And so there is a cost that actually not really well captured by the transaction fees. So there was this concept of dust that was put in. Basically, if you have an output that the value of which cannot be covered by the fees itself, right? So it's like, you add an output that increases the size of the transaction, and you're going to have to pay fees that are even higher for that. And this is basically, it's considered an uneconomical output, and so we don't want to be adding those because nodes will then have to verify it. Blocks, a full nodes will have to carry that information for all of eternity. That should be something that's put off on a layer 2, or if you really want it, you should pay for it. One interesting thing, though, about dust is that, first of all, it's relative as well to the fee rate. So we might have to increase this as fees go up in the future. But another thing is that it's not actually consensus. There's no consensus rule that says dust is not allowed. So if you sent a transaction directly to a miner and they put it in a block and you paid them enough to do that, there's nothing wrong with that block now. There are other types of transactions and outputs that would be unallowed, right? But this is a totally valid transaction. It's disallowed by policy at the node level. So nodes, if you try and send a dust transaction, they'll say, hey, that's dust. I don't like that. I'm not going to send it to other nodes. So that's one thing to keep in mind.
I do see another question coming through, and this was asked by Dhruv, and many folks in the audience might be thinking the same thing. So I'm going to answer it live here. The question is for future viewers: how many UTXOs can you stack onto a multisig vault prior to authoring or needing to consolidate your UTXOs? When does it really become an issue? And does the type of wallet matter? So in answering this, first and foremost, you want to lay the foundation of your Bitcoin in your vault. It's always secured by your keys, right? UTXOs stacking up in your vault just really becomes a burden for you as a key holder if it gets too high. But your funds are always secured by Bitcoin multi-signature. So the funds themselves are never at risk or anything like that. But it just becomes a nice wallet or a vault hygiene thing to keep your vaults, your UTXO count low, just so you can save on fees should the need arise to move Bitcoin in the future. Like Buck has highlighted, you might be wanting to move collateral into a loan. You might be wanting to move Bitcoin out of your vault. You just want to be in a nice position where you're not going to be paying crazy fees. So a direct answer: how many UTXOs can you stack onto a multisig vault prior to needing to consolidate? Well, usually my answer to that would be about 20 to 25 deposits or UTXOs onto a given address. Once it's that high, you should really think about maybe doing a consolidation. And all a consolidation, a UTXO consolidation is just doing a little bit of a little spend out of your vault. Could be $5 worth of Bitcoin somewhere else. Could be donating to the Human Rights Foundation, could be sending to another wallet that you own. That in and of itself is a UTXO consolidation, because you're taking the rest of those UTXOs and pushing them up to a new address in your vault where you just have one UTXO, or unspent transaction output. So I'd say about 20 to 25. And that's really important for you dollar cost averaging folks out there who are buying Bitcoin every week and sending to your vault. You really want to be mindful about how many deposits your vault address has on it. Same thing for if you're mining Bitcoin. Mining right to multisig sounds fantastic, and we do want the best security for your Bitcoin, but you also need to really hone in on a sound UTXO strategy when doing so. The second part of that question is, does the type of wallet matter? Well, the answer to that is yes, although I think the wallet space, the hardware device space, is really improving in this area. So Trezor and Ledger devices, they're built with a lot of onboard memory. They can really pack a punch, and they can sign for, just the other day, sign up for about 80 UTXOs. So, using these devices to sign these transactions, they are pretty powerful. Cold cards, the MK3 is built with a little bit of less onboard memory, and it might struggle a little bit if it's trying to sign for more of that 20 to 25 range. So that's why I noted that range there. But the new MK4 cold card could sign for plenty more UTXOs. So even if your hardware device cannot, sign a transaction in your vault because your number of UTXOs is just so huge that your vault is, your funds are still secure by multisig, there'd just be an additional step that you'd need to do. Ideally, with our team, we'd pop your vault over into Caravan, an external spend tool. We would chunk out those UTXOs individually. It's really just a nice hygiene thing to keep track of, but our team is, of course, there to assist you every step of the way. So that was a fantastic question, Drew. Thank you for asking that.
I would say also there's on the software side of that, of wallet, because that's what I think of when I think of what a wallet is. So on our platform, we don't allow this yet, but Caravan, you can do it, and a lot of other wallet coordinators can do it. If you can do UTXO selection, that gives you a little bit more flexibility, because let's say, if you do have, let's say 40 UTXOs, you can do a consolidation where you just select some of those, and you can do some of those strategies that I was describing earlier, where fees are really low, and you know that you might be doing a spend in a few months for something like loan related or whatever, and just in case fees get high, then you'll consolidate some of your UTXOs now while fees are low. And so the software, but if the wallet that you're using, let's say you keep Bitcoin on your phone for some reason, and it doesn't allow you to do UTXO consolidation, well, you might want to do spends a little bit more frequently, or change your behavior based off of that as well.
And that kind of ties into another question I'm seeing in the queue for, do wallets have any effect on the fees you're paying? So to that, it's really, I would assume, on a wallet by wallet basis, Buck. It's like, does a given wallet allow for UTXO selection? Was the wallet built, is it a reputable wallet to have funds on, that it was built correctly by engineers that are very thorough in how they're designing a Bitcoin wallet? Do you have change coming back to you? Were all these design decisions made appropriately within the wallet? So that is a really good question. I think your answer previously, Buck, really tied in.
If we're talking on the hardware side, then no, right? Like the device, the signing device that you're using has no impact at all. That's just a piece of hardware that's doing some cryptographic signatures with your private key. But on the software side, yeah, because the other thing too is does it allow for RBF? If you do have some output management, that would allow you to, for example, do a child case for parent. This is another thing. Or if it enables RBF. So on the software side, yes. On the hardware side, no.
Awesome. Well, I know we are coming up on the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and make this big slide a little bit bigger. And want to thank everybody for joining this continuing education webinar about understanding Bitcoin transaction fees. These continuing education webinars, first Friday of every month, they're made for clients to empower you along your Bitcoin journey through education, covering different topics, making sure our ultimate goal is that you feel comfortable and confident working with keys, working with multisig, and maybe learn something along the way. Again, highly encourage you to make your way over to Austin for the Austin BitDev, so you can see Buck in action as well, talking about these technical concepts. It's really fun to dive in, and every time you're exposed to it, you learn just a little bit more. So Thank you, everybody, for joining. Buck, if you want to say any last words as a sign off as well.
No, thanks everyone for joining. And fees are really important. I think they're not fully understood by even people that have been using Bitcoin for a very long time. And so this is all an important part of becoming a better Bitcoin user, better Bitcoin citizen. Really contributing to the space. And if you use fees, if you use the transaction block space more efficiently, that actually has some positive externalities for everybody else that's using the network. And so this is all really important to making this a better space.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you, everybody. We'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.